Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Kevin Nute. He's a professor of architecture at the University of Oregon. Nute's research focuses on qualities of built environments that resonate directly with building users. His most recent work, Vital, Using the Weather to Bring Buildings and Sustainability to Life, is a video animated ebook. In it, Nute explains how the natural movements of the sun, wind, and rain can be used to improve the well-being of building occupants and raise awareness of sustainable living practices. Thank you, Kevin, for coming on the show.
Thanks for the invitation.
What led to your work on Vital, Using Weather to Bring Buildings and Sustainability to Life? How'd you come up with this idea?
A couple of issues. One relating to a lack of nature in indoor environments, and the other lack of change in indoor environments. It's a complicated, convoluted story, but the EPA about 20 years ago published figures to say that most people in the Western world spend well over 90% of their lives in indoor environments, over 90% in, or close to 90% in buildings of some kind, and the rest in vehicles. So given those figures and these two deficiencies, this was a problem, or two problems, that got my interest.
And you had been working in Japan. You had studied Frank Lloyd Wright in Japan. You had studied space and time in Japan. Did that play a role in responding to these problems that you were interested in?
Absolutely. I'd been immersed in that culture for such a long time, and I was looking, having completed some work on time in Japanese buildings and in culture more generally, looking for the next step, but wanting to keep contact with what I knew. And these kinds of examples where an appreciation of natural phenomena are, as many people know, are ingrained in that culture. So the number of examples, the density of examples was just, well, extremely high and probably unique in the world. I've tried to do this kind of thing in this country, and the distances involved and the sort of density of examples is much more difficult to deal with as a researcher.
You begin the title with the word vital. Why is this vital? How do you mean vital?
Well, in deliberately ambiguous sense, in terms of energy and life, which many indoor environments subject us, not deliberately, but to a form of low-level sensory deprivation. We are still, in evolutionary terms, physiologically very similar to our distant ancestors and who evolved largely outside. So physiologically, we're dependent on contact with nature and a varying environment. And yet we spend 90% of our lives indoors. So vital in the sense of bringing indoor spaces back to life, which is what we actually need, but also in terms of an imperative that this is important for our own well-being in terms of alertness and attention. There's also another component, which if we get to it, I'll talk about.
What is this other component?
Well, long-term future of this planet. So there are overlaps between the elements that are used in this book, sunlight, wind, and rain, and sustainable living practices that concerning buildings. So those living practices are still only used in a tiny percentage of buildings worldwide. And one of the issues with why that's the case is that many members of the public are just not aware of them even when they are being used. So what I've tried to do is to show intersections, overlaps between animating indoor spaces, but also animating these passive energy saving and rainwater harvesting techniques so that users of buildings are actually more aware of them.
So let's talk first about animating indoor spaces. How do you talk about doing that? How do we do that?
Well, the weather seemed to fit the bill in terms of solving these two problems. I should go back a moment, Paul, and say that there's long established research that contact with nature is extremely good at reducing human stress. So in the last 30 years, there's been an enormous amount of work on that. And you only need to look at the effects of walks in nature and from sort of anecdotal evidence, and the fact that we habitually bring nature indoors in terms of plants and pets, etc. There's also been work for the last half century, starting at McGill University, with work on sensory deprivation. This was back in the Cold War, when the US was worried about pilots being brainwashed. So those two missing elements, contact with nature and contact with change, sensory variation, I was looking for something that would solve those problems in multiple environments. So we can't bring pets into every building. We can't go out all the time when we wish to. Sometimes the weather's bad. The weather then was this sort of omnipresent in both senses of the term. It's everywhere, but it's always current, it's always changing. Element that fit the bill. It's free, it's available pretty much everywhere all the time. It's not distracting because we're so attuned to it. We don't generally, unless it's extreme, pay much conscious attention, but it does keep us alert. It also is overlapping, as I say, with the usual suspects when it comes to passive energy and rainwater saving, sunlight, wind, and rain. So the issue, the challenge for this research was, well, we get taught in first year of architecture that the prime thing that buildings do is to keep the weather out. So I've been spending the last decade trying to bring it in, much to my colleagues' kind of puzzlement. But there's a serious conflict there. How do you maintain physical shelter but bring the movement, which is what I've been trying to do, of the weather indoors? And there were three techniques then, methods, simple methods that seem to work. One is to enclose nature in internal courtyards so that it is technically still outside, but if you deal with the interface between the courtyard and the interior space in the right ways, it can feel like that tree that's moving in the wind, for example, feels like it, to all intents, it's part of the space that we're in. Another method is to project, to use sunlight or artificial light, if it's at night, to project movement. You've seen this kind of thing. We've all seen these phenomena actually serendipitously, where shadows of leaves, for example, might be projected on an internal surface. What I'm suggesting in this work is, well, if that happened serendipitously, what would happen if we deliberately did this as architects, intended this to happen? And the other method is back projection, where there's a translucent material and the movement of the weather is projected onto that surface. But again, it feels like it's part of the enclosing surface of the interior space.
So you use mirrors, you use light sources that are outside the house being projected outside the building. Tell us about some of the techniques.
So the light source is primarily the sun. At night, because obviously we now extend the day typically beyond sunset, this will work with artificial lights as well. So most of these techniques are visible or visually based. Some of them are acoustic, though. After dark, especially, we depend on those signals to tell us about environmental conditions outside. So they're mostly based on sunlight. Some of them don't require direct sunlight. They will work in cloudy, overcast conditions. And there are one or two examples. The camera obscura work by Ethan Jackson that I've included. That requires some tricks, but not complicated. A lens and a mirror is as complicated as it goes. And you can actually have full color, live moving images of the outdoors with a lens and a mirror, which is kind of remarkable. That technology has existed for about 3,000 years. The Chinese were aware of it, and we don't use it. And yet many of us who do even have pretty good indoor environments, we may not, in other words, having windows, etc., we may not be close enough to take advantage of the view. We may, and there are quite a number, I was surprised when I looked at the numbers, there are a large percentage of occupiable spaces that have no windows whatsoever. Everything is artificially conditioned. So the camera obscura, where you only need a pinhole on an external surface to bring that live external imagery inside, seems like a wonderful, what's the word, bargain in terms of what you have to do in order to get this prize of a view, contact with the outdoors.
So one of the ways that people bring nature in is they put photographs of nature on their walls or paintings of nature on their walls. But in your account, a crucial part of this is you just use the word live, movement, change. Why is that so important? Why is it better to have the motion of the leaves rather than just the image of the tree?
Well, you've basically described it. The work on alertness and attention showed, and this was about 50 years ago, up at McGill, as I mentioned, that after about 15 minutes of, even with sensory stimulation, if that stimulation isn't changing, the brain, rather like a computer screen, will go to sleep. It will start to shut down. So that's why we were advised as teachers, after 15 minutes, change things up, because it's the natural physiology. If you put somebody in a seat in a darkened room, they will eventually, especially in my lectures, you know. So that changeability, that variation is important. The challenge is, if you just use any old thing, especially artificially made change, it becomes a distraction. So it defeats the object. If you're trying to get something done and you want to remain alert, but not distracted. And the great thing about the weather is we're so conditioned to that as a background that we don't give it conscious attention. So it can keep us alert without being distracting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, fascinating. So you've just described this problem, the difference between distraction and alertness. Another problem that the book addresses is, okay, this is what you want to share with people. You want to make this argument. You want to show people these things. How are you going to do that in a book? So
yeah.
How do you solve that problem?
Well, it was a big headache. I'm a paper book guy, and that's what I do, you know. And so I banged my head against that wall for quite a while, and we talked about paper books with a CD, and none of this was very satisfying, because the movement of these natural weather phenomena is central, and without that, it's not quite the same. So about 2 years ago, it became possible to embed video with sound into the more sophisticated ebooks. And so I don't want to advertise here, but some are still struggling with that, but some of those platforms you can already do that on, and it was a gift for me. This was the first time ever in my entire career that I've been at the leading edge of technology, and it came along just, well, and it will probably be the last one, but it came along just at the right time, because I was crying out to have some control over how the book looked, and I was able to do this with this software, but also to embed video and include sound, so it was a perfect kind of match.
Did you need to work with computer scientists and collaborators to do this, or is this software that...
No, this was, can I mention a commercial product?
You're a free agent?
iBooks Author is a typical kind of Apple interface, very easy. If I can learn it, you know, at my age, anybody could. And it was perfectly capable of embedding moving images and sound. And the great thing, as somebody who's interested in design, including the layout of a page, I was able to keep control of that, rather than sending all the components off and having somebody else turn it into, well, a reflowable book, for example, where everything alters. This is a fixed layout. And again, you'd have to understand the sort of design professions, I suppose, but that control thing about the way you want it to look is a big deal. So, as I say, it was a perfect match.
I noticed on my iPad, I downloaded it, and I had the iPad in the vertical position, and it forced me to...
Yes, the controlling designer, yes, that's me.
So tell us how the book is organized.
The book's basically sets out the problems, the issues that we spend 90% of our lives in buildings, that we independently have been proven to need contact with nature and change, and the vast majority of those buildings lack both nature and change. Talks about the techniques, the enclosure, the projection, the back projection of how to bring the animation of the weather in without the weather itself, to maintain shelter. And then it looks at the three, as I mentioned, the usual suspects when it comes to the weather and passive environmental control. For those who don't know that term, it's a jargon term that we use in architecture for using natural means to control indoor environments as opposed to HVAC, air conditioning, etc. It's better for us in terms of our health, but it's also better for the planet. So there are 3 central chapters that deal, one with sunlight, one with wind, one with rain. A final chapter deals with the overlaps with sustainable practices. How can you use that animation, which is primarily to keep us alert and attentive without being distracting, but how could you also overlap that and use that animation to draw attention to, in a non-distracting way, to things like passive solar gain, you know, and the word passive kind of goes to the heart of it. It's so passive that how do you know that a concrete wall is picking up solar energy? It doesn't even get warm. That's the whole point. There are some techniques you can use, though. You can actually see heat. Sometimes we see, you know, you'll see it rippling off a radiator, for example. Or so it was those very simple, almost, well, you know, they're high school physics kind of natural phenomenal effects that most of us are aware of, that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about or wouldn't find distracting. How to use them, how to leverage those to draw attention to these very serious, important practices that need to be used more widely. And to do that, the general public needs to be on board. Sustainability is not just for a few professionals to kind of build responsible buildings. The number of buildings built by architects is a tiny percentage of those constructed every year across the world. Even in this country, and in other countries less and less. So it's very important that the users of buildings who have some control over those buildings, over existing buildings, not just new buildings, are aware of these techniques, that they're not complicated, that they're not expensive, that you can do it for, you know, $50 and you could totally change your indoor environment.
So I assume from what you just said that your target audience here is not the 30 architects in the United States who are studying this.
Not primarily. I mean, of course, I'm interested in what my peers have to say, and I want to influence them. And one reason I teach is that I feel like I can influence more buildings ultimately by influencing large numbers of architects who go into practice than I could if I were beavering away in you know, in a practice on my own someplace. There are other reasons as well, but yes, it's the existing building stock as much as the new buildings. We tend to be, as designers, especially in a School of Architecture, largely concerned with how things could be. And of course, the pile of ideas for, well, if you had enough money, this is what we could do, is very large. I'm much more concerned with the existing building stock, which we cannot afford to just make go away. So how can you upgrade those buildings quickly and simply, and do it yourself, and change your environment, rather than, well, if you had $500,000, you could build a new building. You know?
So tell us about some of those techniques of retrofitting that you're talking about.
Well, if you have a window, an aperture, then several of these techniques would work. It's just a matter really of how you treat the glazing in that. You could put translucent glazing in it. You could add shading, an awning of some kind. You could put natural shading, foliage outside of it, as long as it's aligned with sunlight. So it's really, I often say to my students, you know, what we do as architects is move stuff around, hopefully intelligently. That's kind of what we do, and most members of the public can do that if they've got some suggestions.
So it's an ebook. You publish it. You and Apple published it. Anyone can buy it very quickly. It's aimed at a more general audience. What about internationally? You're not just aiming for people that read English, right?
No, and I hope that these phenomena are pretty transcultural, that even if somebody's having a problem reading the text, that this is a largely image-driven, and that's one of the wonderful things. I would like to think that I could show some of these images to somebody straight out of the Amazon jungle, and they would understand what I'm talking about even without me saying, that these phenomena are everywhere and that they're ingrained into all of us and at a level that is far below culture. So it's very primitive in the best sense of the word, and I think that that connects us all.
You've talked a couple of times already about how in the final chapter and overall you're partially interested in a kind of consciousness raising. You're trying to make people have a relationship to sustainability which is conscious and more active and more widespread. Explain a little bit more how these techniques are going to raise that consciousness in your readers and in the people that are living in these.
It's awareness mostly. So bringing things, as I mentioned, a lot of passive energy techniques they're known to professionals, but they don't, because of their nature, they're passive. They don't move, they don't do very much. So all you know about it as a end user is that you get a smaller utility bill at the end of the month, which is very welcome, but it's just for a moment. Right? What I'm trying to do is to look at how we can start a conversation. For example, with somebody who doesn't know, a young person, whatever, might say, "That's cool. Those caustics, which are light effects reflected on an interior ceiling. First of all, it's going to be, that's cool, I hope. Then it's like, what is that? And there's some physics to be talked about, some very simple physics of light and waves. But then there's a conversation as to, well, why are you doing that? Is it just pretty? Is it just for fun? Or, well, actually, if you reflect light off a surface of water, which happens to be a perfect mirror, into a building, you can turn the lights off more. And that means we don't have to use the power station so much. And there's a whole beginning of a conversation. And the intention is to enter that conversation about sustainability and about this planet through an alternative avenue, through beauty, as opposed to the sort of doom and gloom scenario, which is relevant and important. But I think a lot of people, after a while, become kind of punch drunk over, with all of that. If people, especially young people, are made aware of how beautiful this stuff is, maybe they're then in the mood to say, well, you realize that we're in danger of destroying that stuff. They might be more interested.
Fascinating. Can you tell us about some locations, some buildings locally that we might know where we could see some of these techniques in action?
There was one that we did some experiments on. We were kind of temporary guests, so we didn't actually permanently, but we did some work on a local medical clinic on the waiting patients. We were looking for a situation where people were waiting, which is a source of stress, and waiting for a doctor's appointment, and double stress. So you're underoccupied. Most people don't bring work. So we introduced some water light shelves in that practice. I don't know whether we'll be able to put them back up again.
Can you tell me what a water light shelf is?
It's very complicated. It's an inch of water that sits in a tray like an awning outside of, in this case it was outside, so it was affected by the wind, and the sun would hit that and reflect. But so the movement of the light, I'd have to show you images for this to make any sense of it, was being animated by the wind, but it was on the interior ceiling. You'll come across these examples, as I said, serendipitously. And my message is, well, this could happen a lot more often if we deliberately went about it from day one, and not just professional designers. I'm blanking on local buildings. I'll think of one in a moment. Actually, the EMU here at the university, the bit that they just knocked down, I did some filming in there. So you can imagine, I was kind of glad that I filmed it, but there was a very large area of glazing in there. And when it rained, as it is today, like in torrents, sheets of water would be displayed, and apart from the noise of the rain, you couldn't be in that big glazed atrium without being aware of what the weather was doing. It had all sorts of other environmental problems. It was a huge energy loser, for example, so it doesn't fit, or didn't fit the bill perfectly. But yes, there are examples. They're not, the idea is that this is not an exotic thing, that you can come across examples, but they may not always be deliberate.
I know from reading the book, viewing the book, that many of the examples that you show, and you alluded to this early in the conversation, are from Japan. And you mentioned to me before we began speaking that these techniques are actually ancient, that they've been part of architecture for millennia. Say a little bit more about the omnipresence or the commonality of this in different cultures as opposed to our own.
Well, we talked about, it began by me being surrounded by this stuff from previous research and realizing that, and my interest in Japan actually has always been rather different from a lot of Japan specialists. I mean, I'm not a Japan specialist. I don't regard myself as, I'm interested in what they've understood about human nature. In other words, what they share in common with me. I'm never going to be a Japanese, and from what I've learned, I could stay there for 50 years and I'll never be accepted as nor do I wish to be. But understanding what that culture is understood about, the sort of common underlying characteristics is important. And that's what has always fascinated me about that. That's what Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, was interested in. He wasn't interested in creating Japanese architecture. He was interested in American architecture. But he was interested in understanding what human being was about and understanding, and that culture seems to have got under the skin of people across the globe, travel thousands of miles every year to look at buildings, for example, gardens that they won't necessarily understand in a social, cultural context, and yet at some deep level they understand, and it's that level that I'm interested in.
So we have about a minute left. I know that after this academic year you'll be taking a sabbatical. Do you have a new project that you'll be working on? Are you going to extend this project?
I'd like to, well, I certainly want to be talking about this. This is, we haven't really talked about it, but this does have a temporal component, and that's the next project to do with time. I mean, so I left time, at least explicitly, in the last book on Japanese architecture, but this is to do with the present, of remaining. Mindfulness is now a popular term. And so this is about a non-technical kind of means of remaining in the present then. But I'm interested in the other two genuinely temporal kind of domains then, and especially in a built context, how, because time is so much more important than space to most people. If you stop them in the street, architects are the other way around. They obsess about space and forget about time a lot of the time. So I want to remind people that time is enormously important to us, and yet it's missing from a lot of built environments where, again, we spend 90% of our lives. So that's the next one. That might be 20 years. Yeah.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for talking to us about your work, about your book, about what you're going to do next. It's been really a great pleasure to speak with you.
And me too. Thank you very much.
I've been speaking with Professor of Architecture at the University of Oregon, Kevin Nute. His book, Vital: Using the Weather to Bring Buildings and Sustainability to Life, is available at vitalarchitecture.org. Thanks so much for watching.